Hey everyone, now we're going to do the chapter 13 discussion on hate speech. And I think this is a pretty simple chapter to analyze and understand simply because it's a question of treating people like people. When we talk about hate speech, it is speech that is targeted at a single person or a group of people that share values and or identifications that are then being insulted and or targeted by speech that is set to induce violence. When we look at that as the classification of hate speech, we have to understand first and foremost it's never acceptable. And if it's a form of speech that's never acceptable, then it's something that we do need to regulate and do need to monitor. A good place to look at hate speech being regulated and monitored is actually on college campuses. College campuses have done an incredibly good job at working to maintain safe spaces for people to speak, but while also making sure that they're not infringing on anyone else's rights. A really good example is the LSU Baton Rouge campus and their free speech alley. They have an alley on campus where people are allowed to set up tents and say anything they want as long as they're not infringing on another person's rights and or working to incite violence against a group of people. And they have staff and faculty monitors that monitor Free Speech Alley so that they're actually going to continue to protect the students on campus. But it isn't that simple all the time, because hate speech is something that we see not only in regular conversation, but also on the internet. And even though the internet is forever, people take things down and then they're less likely to be held accountable for their speech actions. And that's where the government really does come into play. They outline specific things that are not allowed in free speech, and those free speech exemptions do include hate speech. And this inclusion of hate speech is incredibly representative of the situation that we live in the United States. Because we have groups of people that work to just demean and undermine individuals' rights to be a person, we see that we have to continue to regulate free speech and hate speech. Because if hate speech is going to be targeting a specific gender or racial minority, that's incredibly clear that it is hate speech. But sometimes when we see religious minorities being targeted, or even religious majorities, we don't see that there's a lot of action being taken. People like Westboro Baptist are some of the most iconic individuals that end up turning regular speech into hate speech just on the drop of a hat. They're outcasting and working to make individuals feel like they're lesser and or they're inciting violence towards groups of people only because they're a specific kind of person. And what we see is that that's incredibly problematic. Now, the way that we can do this in order to regulate what is said without the government infringing on people's rights is just like we have the limit or the slap test. We just have to have a very specific set of limits and regulations as to what is and is not hate speech. And just like most judicial tests, it's something that can be altered as time goes on, or something that can be restricted or even loosened as the perceptions of society change and people become more understanding of what is and is not appropriate speech. If we don't allow for the government to regulate this, it does become a situation in which people are just as worried about what they can and cannot say, even if they're just sharing an opinion. Because a lot of the time on social media networks right now, individuals that are just sharing a problematic opinion, but are not speaking hatefully, are still getting attacked for hate speech. And that specifically shows once again the necessity for having something to outline what is and is not hate speech. Now, we can't do like college campuses do and have specific people trained and set out to monitor every single conversation that ever happens, even if the NSA kind of does that now. We have to look and we have to work to find ways to mitigate the impacts of hate speech and mitigate the amount of people targeted and negatively impacted by such a situation. Thanks, everyone.